She called the police on me for blocking my own driveway, but she had no idea the man she was reporting was the one who commanded the officers she summoned. It started on a quiet Saturday morning. I had parked my truck across my own driveway because I was unloading heavy equipment. Nothing unusual, at least not for a normal neighbor. But Karen was not normal. She marched over, arms crossed, sunglasses perched high like she was ready to issue a citation. "You can't block the driveway," she snapped. "It's my driveway," I reminded her, pointing to the deed number engraved on the side post. Karen didn't like being corrected. Her lips pinched, her nostrils flared, and she stormed away muttering something about community standards. I thought that would be the end of it. I should have known better. 15 minutes later, the calm of the neighborhood shattered as red and blue lights danced across the houses, splashing a chaotic glow over my garage door like a low-budget action scene. Karen stood at the end of my driveway, waving both arms dramatically as if she were guiding a helicopter to land, or reporting the crime of the century. Her face was twisted into the determined expression of someone who believed she was single-handedly saving civilization. The patrol car rolled to a slow stop. Two officers stepped out, blinking as though unsure whether they'd arrived at an emergency or a community theater performance. Karen immediately rushed toward them, pointing at my parked truck as if it were a ticking bomb. "He's blocking the community access lane," she yelled, her voice shrill enough to make a nearby dog bark in protest. The first officer, a tall guy who looked like he hadn't finished his coffee, approached me cautiously. "Sir," he asked, uncertain, "are you parked on your own property?" "Yes," I replied calmly, "and I have documents to prove it." I could practically see the relief wash over him. Finally, a simple case, but Karen wasn't having it. She shoved herself between us, waving a crumpled HOA rule sheet like it was the U.S. Constitution. "This driveway is shared property," she insisted, squinting at the officer like she was daring him to challenge her authority. "Shared with who?" I asked, genuinely curious how far her imagination stretched. The second officer walked the length of my driveway, inspecting the layout like a surveyor. He paused, tilted his head, then looked back at Karen with the baffled expression of a man who had just discovered someone arguing that water isn't wet. "Ma'am," he said slowly, "there is no shared property here. This driveway is clearly marked and documented as private." Karen stomped her foot like an angry toddler denied candy. "You don't understand. He keeps blocking the community's flow of traffic." "What community?" the officer asked. "This is a dead-end street." She turned red, then purple, then a shade of maroon I didn't know humans could achieve. "You're not listening. He always parks here to intimidate me." The second officer raised an eyebrow. "By parking in his own driveway." "Yes," she shrieked as though she had just delivered an irrefutable point. The officers exchanged a look, the kind of look that said, "We're dealing with a special one today." The first officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, there is no violation here." Karen gasped like someone had slapped her. "Write him a ticket, tow the truck." "We can't tow someone's vehicle from their own property," the officer replied, trying not to laugh. "That's illegal." "Then make it legal," she snapped. She was trembling with fury now, jabbing her finger in the air, packing back and forth like a villain in a low-budget soap opera. The officers tried to de-escalate, but Karen kept raising the stakes. "He's threatening the integrity of the neighborhood. He's creating hazards. He's making it impossible for emergency vehicles to pass." The officer looked up and down the empty street. "Ma'am, an ambulance could drive through here doing donuts." Karen huffed loudly. "You don't understand the rules. I'm the HOA president." "We know," the officer said gently. "You told the dispatcher 8 times. She puffed her chest like it was a badge of honor. "And as the president, I authorize you to enforce a citation." The officer sighed. "That's not how police work." Karen's eyes bulged. "Why are you taking his side?" "We're not taking sides," the officer said with the patience of a saint. "We're taking facts." She turned to me with a wild glare. "Show them your documents." "Gladly," I said. I stepped into the garage and returned with a folder, the official property plat, purchase documents, and municipal layouts. The officers flipped through the papers, nodding. "Everything checks out," the first officer confirmed. Karen tried to snatch the documents from his hand, but he pulled them back with a firm, "Ma'am, don't." "These are forged," she declared dramatically. He made these, the officer blinked slowly. Ma'am, these came from the municipal office. He could have hacked it. Do you hear yourself? The officer asked. She did not. Karen spiraled deeper into delusion. He's using the driveway to spy on my house. He parks there to provoke me. He waits for me to come outside so he can assert dominance. I couldn't help it, I laughed. The officers tried to hide their amusement, but the corners of their mouths twitched. Ma'am, the second officer said, we cannot arrest, ticket, or tow someone for parking on their own property, not even if the HOA president is upset. Karen's jaw dropped so far I worried it might hit the pavement. This is harassment, she shouted. From who? The officer asked. You, she yelled, pointing at me. Then she pointed at the officers. And you, and the system, everyone. The officers exchanged that look again, equal parts concern and how do we politely escape this nightmare. Finally, the first officer took a slow step back. Ma'am, unless there is an actual emergency, we cannot continue responding to non-issues. Karen opened her mouth to argue, but he added, and repeated misuse of emergency services is a chargeable offense. Silence. Sweet, glorious silence. For a moment, the universe held still. Then Karen's face twisted into a horrified expression, like someone who had just realized her favorite soap opera character died. Are you threatening me? No, ma'am, we're informing you. The officers turned to me. Sorry for the inconvenience, sir. You're fine to continue your day. I nodded, trying not to grin. But Karen wasn't done. As they walked back to the patrol car, she shrieked, I will report all of you, I know people. The second officer paused just long enough to mutter, we know people too, before he slid into the car. The engine started. The lights turned off. Quiet returned. Karen stood frozen in my driveway, trembling with righteous outrage, completely unaware that this was only the beginning of a very long day for her. The officers stepped a few feet aside with me, far enough that Karen couldn't hear but close enough that she kept trying to hover within earshot like a mosquito orbiting a light bulb. The older officer rubbed the bridge of his nose, exhaustion practically dripping from his voice. Sir, sorry about all this, he muttered. But she insisted we file a report. Protocol says we have to submit something. I exhaled slowly. This wasn't new. Neighborhood theatrics had a way of dragging officers into nonsense. But Karen's flair for chaos was on another level. No problem, I told him. I'll stop by the station later and sort it out. The younger officer looked puzzled, brow lifting as he studied me more closely. You work with the department? He asked hesitantly, as though he wasn't sure if he'd accidentally missed a familiar face at briefing. I let the suspense hang for a heartbeat, watching both of them try to reconcile my calm demeanor with the absurd situation unfolding behind us. Then I smiled. I'm not just with the department. Karen, still packing and pretending to be on the edge of a meltdown, perked up at the tone of my voice, inching closer like she was preparing to interrupt again. I reached into my wallet, pulled out my badge and ID, and held them up just enough for the officers to see clearly. I'm your commanding officer. The transformation was immediate and dramatic, more dramatic than Karen's entire performance combined. Both officers stiffened as if hit with an electric jolt. Their expressions snapped from casual annoyance to rigid professionalism. The younger one's eyes widened to the size of headlights. The older one swallowed hard, shoulders snapping back into perfect alignment. Sir, he blurted, voice suddenly formal. We didn't realize. At ease, I said quietly. They eased up, but only slightly. Karen, noticing their sudden shift in posture, misread it completely. Her face lit up with triumph, as if she believed the officers were finally recognizing her status as the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA universe. She strutted toward us with the swagger of someone who thought she just won a court case. That's right, she announced, smugness dripping from every syllable. Now you see who's in charge around here. The younger officer glanced at her, then at me, then quickly away, clearly fighting the urge to laugh. Oh, we definitely do, he murmured under his breath, shaking his head slightly. Karen crossed her arms, chin raised, blissfully unaware that she was the only person confident in her interpretation of the situation. Good, she continued loudly. Because this man has been violating HOA ordinances for weeks, and you finally have the authority figure who understands community standards. The older officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am," but she cut him off with a sharp "No, I will speak." The officers shot me a look that screamed, "Please get us out of this before we lose brain cells." I raised a hand subtly, signaling them to wait. This was going to get much more entertaining. Karen continued her self-appointed victory speech, packing back and forth. "You should have seen the way he blocked the driveway, officer. Completely unacceptable. The neighborhood bylaws clearly state—" "Karen," I said calmly. She froze, turned, squinted. "What?" "You asked for an authority figure." I tapped the badge lightly. "You got one." She frowned, confused, like her brain was buffering. "What does that mean?" "It means," the younger officer said carefully, "he is our commanding officer, our direct superior, the person who trains and evaluates us." Karen blinked. "No, he's not." "Yes, ma'am," the older officer replied, his voice now formal and steady. "He outranks everyone on our patrol unit." Karen stared at me, eyes narrowing as though she were trying to solve a complex math equation. But you're just a homeowner." "I can be more than one thing at a time," I replied. The younger officer added, "He's the person you're demanding we file a complaint against." The realization hit her like a brick to the forehead. Her mouth opened, closed, opened again. No sound came out, which was a historic moment for anyone who had ever encountered her. Her bravado cracked right down the middle. "You mean you're the boss?" "The commanding officer," the older officer corrected gently. "Yes." Karen's expression began its transformation through several stages: denial, confusion, panic but pretending not to be panicking, and finally pure dread. But I didn't know," she stammered. "If I had known, I wouldn't have called the police on me," I offered. She sputtered. "I was enforcing community regulations." The younger officer coughed into his sleeve to hide a laugh. Karen spun toward him. "And why didn't you tell me he worked with you?" "Ma'am, we had no idea who he was until he showed his badge," the officer explained, maintaining composure by pure willpower. Karen pointed at me like she had discovered a conspiracy. "You tricked me." "By parking in my own driveway?" I asked. She inhaled sharply, preparing another rant, but her voice wavered like a flimsy flag in the wind. This is wildly inappropriate. You should have told me who you were." "You don't usually give people a chance to speak," I replied lightly but truthfully. The officers both nodded in agreement. Karen's face darkened. "So what happens now?" she asked. Her voice was small for the first time. I held her gaze. "Now," I said, sliding my badge back into my wallet. "Now I go to the station and file the report you insisted on." Karen paled. Against me?" "No," I said calmly. "About the incident and the misuse of emergency response services." The officers shifted uncomfortably, not because of me, but because Karen looked like she might faint. But I didn't mean I thought I only," she stammered. "You called officers to a non-emergency situation," the older officer explained. "Multiple times according to dispatch." And, the younger one added, "You demanded enforcement of rules that don't exist." Karen covered her mouth with her hand, eyes darting everywhere except toward mine. Her self-made empire was crumbling right in front of her, and she didn't know whether to run, cry, or demand a recount. "This isn't fair," she whispered. "Fair," I replied, "is me handling this professionally instead of as the man whose driveway you keep trying to claim." She had no response, only stunned silence. The officers stepped back, waiting for instructions. I nodded at them. "You're clear. I'll finish the paperwork." "Yes, sir," they said in unison, relieved to escape. As they walked toward the patrol car, Karen remained frozen in place, her previous arrogance replaced by a wide-eyed horror. And for the first time since the chaos began, she understood exactly who she had been picking a fight with. When Karen heard the words "commanding officer," she froze mid-step like someone had hit her with a mental pause button. Her face went blank, her mouth slightly open, her eyes darting between me and the officers as if she were trying to determine whether this was some elaborate prank. The silence stretched just long enough to become uncomfortable, long enough for her brain to catch up to what she had just done. She swallowed hard. You can't be serious." "Oh, I'm very serious," I told her, keeping my voice calm, steady, and just stern enough to let her know the situation had shifted beyond her control. Karen attempted to laugh, but it came out as a shaky, brittle sound like glass cracking under pressure. "Well, mistakes happen," she said too quickly. "I probably misread the property map. You know how confusing those things can be." Officer Davis raised an eyebrow. "You didn't misread anything," he said firmly. "We've responded to your misreads 5 times this month." Corinne's color drained so fast it was almost impressive. She stared at him like he had exposed her deepest secret. 5? That's impossible. I would never— "Ma'am," Davis cut in gently but unambiguously, "you've called us for noise complaints that didn't exist, parking violations that weren't violations, and accusations against neighbors that were disproven every single time." Corinne looked like she'd been punched in the stomach. "This isn't fair," she snapped. "I'm just enforcing community rules." But nobody was buying it, not the officers, not me, and certainly not the neighborhood dogs who had come outside to watch the drama unfold like a live episode of their favorite show. Corinne's eyes darted from one face to another, searching desperately for any sign of support or sympathy. She found none. Officer Reynolds stepped forward, crossing his arms. "Ma'am, you can't enforce rules that aren't in your HOA bylaws. And you definitely can't create new rules on the spot." She blinked. I never created rules, I simply interpreted them." "Interpreted," Davis repeated slowly as though tasting the word. "Ma'am, last week you told a family they couldn't have a trampoline because it attracted bad energy." Corinne gasped. "It does attract bad energy," Reynolds shook his head. "The week before that, you accused Mr. Patterson of violating the HOA dress code for wearing a Hawaiian shirt while mowing his lawn." "It was neon green," Corinne hissed, as if that justified everything. "Ma'am," Reynolds replied, "neon isn't a crime." Corinne clutched her pearl necklace, her emotional support accessory, like it was the last tether holding her sanity together. "This is all being blown out of proportion," she insisted. "You don't understand how much work I do for this community." "We understand perfectly," I said. "You overstep repeatedly." She flinched like the words were physical blows. "I'm not overstepping," she protested. "I'm trying to maintain order." "By filing false reports?" Davis asked. "By misusing emergency services. By harassing homeowners," Reynolds added. Corinne's face crumpled. "I'm not harassing anyone, I'm being responsible." "Responsibility," I said with deliberate calm, "starts with understanding the limits of your authority." She glared at me, but the edge was gone, her bravado dissolving under the weight of reality. "I had no idea who you were," she muttered. "If I'd known, I wouldn't have called the police," I finished for her. "Misrepresented the property lines, tried to assert power you don't have." She shook her head rapidly, hands trembling. "I didn't mean it like that. This whole situation is being twisted." "Ma'am," Davis said gently, "we watched the whole thing unfold. Nothing is being twisted." Corinne took a step back, then another, as though distance could somehow rewind the last 20 minutes. "But I'm the HOA president," she whispered. "People listen to me." "Ma'am," Reynolds replied, "people tolerate you." That hit harder than anything I could have said. Corinne's lips quivered. I only want the neighborhood to be clean, orderly, peaceful." "It was peaceful," Davis said, "until you escalated it." She flinched. "This can't be happening," she murmured, staring at the pavement like it might open up and swallow her pride whole. "I've dedicated years to this community." "Dedication isn't the issue," I said softly. "Control is." Her eyes lifted to mine, watery, desperate. "Please," she said. "I can fix this. I'll talk to the board. I'll clarify the rules. I'll even—" She paused, searching for a sacrifice worthy of redemption. "I'll even apologize." That surprised all of us, even herself. But Davis shook his head. "Ma'am, this isn't something fixed by apologies. The calls you've made, they're on record. And this incident," Reynolds added, nodding toward his patrol car, "has to be filed. You insisted on it." But she began. "And," Davis said, "you tried to compel us to enforce non-existent laws. That's a misuse of authority." Corinne pressed her hands to her temples, shaking her head with wild, frantic energy. "I wasn't misusing anything. I was protecting the neighborhood." "By accusing your commanding officer of blocking his own driveway?" Reynolds asked, nodding toward me. Corinne winced. "I didn't know who he was." "That doesn't make the accusation valid," I said. "What matters is your behavior, not your target." Her confidence shattered completely. The woman who stormed into the morning like a conquering general now stood trembling like a rookie caught cheating on day one. "So what happens now?" she whispered. The question wasn't confident. It wasn't demanding. It was frightened, vulnerable, a person suddenly aware of consequences she never thought would apply to her. Now, I said, stepping forward with a steady voice, I go to the station, I review the report, and we determine whether this incident qualifies as misuse of emergency resources. Her mouth opened in silent shock. But that could. Yes, I said, it could. She took a shaky breath. You wouldn't, would you? It's my duty to follow procedure, I replied. Just like it's yours to follow HOA bylaws. She staggered backward like she might collapse. The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances, but disciplined enough to stay silent. Karen finally whispered, "Please, I just wanted to keep things under control." I nodded. "And now you've completely lost control of the situation." She couldn't argue. She couldn't deny it. She couldn't even pretend anymore. Karen's confidence didn't just waver. It crumbled, piece by piece, until all that remained was the heavy silence of someone who realized she had finally pushed too far. By Monday morning, every detail of the incident was logged in the system with the cold precision only law enforcement bureaucracy can deliver. False report, misuse of emergency response, harassment, violation of municipal regulations. Each entry sat there, time-stamped, categorized, irrefutable. I reviewed the footage, the dispatch logs, the officer statements, every tiny piece that documented how Karen had turned a petty neighborhood annoyance into a full-scale emergency call just to feed her ego. And when I finished reviewing it all, I didn't draft a neighborly reminder or a polite warning. I drafted an official notice, one that carried the full weight of my position, not as her neighbor, not as a man living 2 houses down, but as a commanding officer responsible for overseeing protocol, accountability, and the proper use of the very officers she tried to manipulate for her personal grudges. Karen received the notice the next afternoon, tucked neatly inside her mailbox like a tiny yellow sun waiting to scorch her world. She must have opened it right there at the curb, because I heard her gasp before I even saw her. The paper shook in her hand as she read the heading. Report to Command Office, mandatory discussion regarding misuse of police resources. Anyone else might have thought it sounded like a formality. Karen knew better. She knew exactly what a mandatory discussion meant. It meant her little stunt had crossed a line, one she couldn't wiggle, charm, or bully her way out of. The letter nearly made her faint. From my window, I watched her knees wobble like she was standing on a sinking ship. She looked at my house, then at the notice, then at my house again. Finally, with the slow dread of someone walking toward a guillotine, she marched to my door and knocked. Not her usual angry pounding, not her usual self-important tapping. A soft, trembling knock like she hoped I wouldn't hear. I opened the door and there she stood, eyes wide, palms sweaty, the notice clutched in her fist like it might explode. "See, can't we handle this informally?" she whispered, voice barely holding itself together. "No," I replied. "Abuse of emergency services is never informal." Her throat tight. She swallowed hard. "It was just a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding doesn't involve filing a knowingly false report." "I didn't know it was false," she protested too quickly, too loudly. "Karen," I said, calm but cold, "you called officers to my home because you decided you didn't like how I parked on my own property." She flinched. "It's still a safety issue." The officers disagreed. "They were confused," she insisted, reaching for excuses like they were drifting away. "They must have misread the map or—" "They didn't misread anything," I said, "and now neither will you." Her gaze darted to the street as if she expected anyone to walk by and save her from this conversation. But no one was coming, not this time. She exhaled shakily. "Look, I didn't think it would escalate like this." "That's the problem," I replied. "You never think." She bristled for a moment, old Karen trying to roar back to life, but the fear in her eyes snuffed out the spark. "If I come to the office," she said slowly, nervously, as if the words were made of glass, "will this be on record?" "It already is on record." Her face drained of color. She clutched the notice to her chest like a shield, even though it offered none. "I'll do anything," she stammered, "anything to clear this up." "Then show up," I said, "on time, prepared, honest." She hated those words. Especially the last one. She looked down at the porch, avoiding my stare. "This could affect HOA protocol, you know," she muttered weakly. "It already has. The board will be furious about—" "The board doesn't control emergency services," I cut in. "And they don't control me." She shut her mouth. For once, she had nothing left to throw. No insults, no threats, no procedural jargon she pretended to know. Just fear, the raw realization that her authority stopped the moment she stepped off her precious HOA's property lines. The hallway behind me felt heavier than the air between us. I could tell she sensed it too, the shift, the new reality, the fact that her game had changed and she was no longer holding the winning cards. "Report to the command office," I said quietly but firmly. "This isn't optional." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them away before they fell, pride still hanging on by a thread. "I understand," she whispered. She turned and walked back toward her house, moving quickly, almost stumbling. Each step looked like it cost her something. When she reached her door, she hesitated, clutched the notice tighter, looked back at me one last time. And then, for the first time since I'd known her, she closed her door softly. No slam, no attitude, no performance, just silence. A silence that told me she finally realized what she'd done. And that the consequences weren't going to disappear just because she wanted them to. Karen entered the office looking like a melting candle, sweaty, nervous, unstable, and visibly regretting every decision that had brought her to that chair. Her eyes darted around the room as if she were hopping to find an exit that didn't exist. I'd seen hardened rookies walk into disciplinary meetings with more confidence than she had. The moment she stepped inside, the cool, official air of the command office swallowed her whole. She clutched her purse like a lifeline, her breathing uneven, her smile shaky and forced, an expression that tried to look composed but failed miserably. "Please, can we keep this between us?" she whispered, voice trembling like a loose window in a thunderstorm. I didn't answer that. I simply gestured to the chair opposite me. She sat so stiffly it looked like she expected the seat itself to explode. I placed a thick stack of documents on the table between us, incident reports, complaints, officer statements, timestamps, even neighborhood camera captures. Karen flinched at the sound of the folder hitting the desk. "These," I said, tapping the file, "are all the incidents you've triggered in the last 6 months." Her face collapsed. She covered her mouth, then her cheeks, then her entire face with both palms as if hiding would erase the paperwork in front of her. "I thought they were legitimate," she squeaked. "No," I said calmly, "you thought you had authority you don't have." Her fingers curled around the edges of her purse. "I was only trying to help the neighborhood. People don't follow the rules. Someone has to keep the community in order." "That someone isn't you," I said, leaning forward, voice steady and cold. "And it definitely isn't done by wasting police time with personal vendettas disguised as emergencies." She opened her mouth, ready to argue, ready to spin a story, ready to blame the officers, the board, the bylaws, the neighbors, even the sky if she had to, but every excuse she tried to pull out only dug her deeper. "I only called once." I slid another sheet forward. She stared at it. "Okay, twice." Another sheet. She swallowed. "Fine, maybe a few times." I placed the stack directly in front of her. Her eyes widened as she realized the printed evidence was far thicker than she remembered her own behavior being. She lifted one sheet. "This wasn't even my fault. Samantha's dog was off-leash." "It was in Samantha's fenced backyard," I reminded her. She blinked rapidly. "Well, what about the noise complaint? The music was too loud. It was her kid practicing piano at 6:00 p.m., but that can still be considered." "It's not." She deflated a little more. "Okay. What about this one, the suspicious vehicle?" "That was the mail van. It was parked weirdly. It was parked at the curb." She paused. "Diagonal. No, straight." Her mouth snapped shut. She flipped through the pages faster now, each sheet a reminder of how exaggerated her community vigilance had become. "A sprinkler left on for 15 minutes. She reported it as reckless water waste endangering property. A neighbor unloading groceries from the trunk. She reported it as a possible burglary. A teen mowing his elderly grandmother's lawn. She insisted it was an unauthorized landscaping service." "It's like you were speedrunning every petty civilian misuse of police resources possible," I said. She shrank into her chair. Her shoulders folded inward, her legs pulled closer, her posture shrinking until she looked more like a student at the principal's office than the HOA president she loved to parade herself as. "I was only trying to enforce the standards," she murmured weakly. "Karen," I said firmly, There is a difference between enforcing community guidelines and acting like law enforcement when you are not. Her jaw twitched. But people expect leadership. No one expects you to call emergency services because someone put out their trash bin 2 hours early. She stared at the table, silent, embarrassed, thoroughly deflated. Do you understand what happens when officers respond to unnecessary calls? I asked. Do you understand what resources you're pulling away from actual emergencies, from people who truly need help? She didn't speak. Not yet, I continued. Officers dropped what they were doing to respond to your calls. Real cases were delayed because of your false alarms, and then your final mistake was calling them over my driveway. Her skin went pale. I didn't know. You didn't care to know, I corrected. That's the problem. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, filling the silence between us. Corinne's breathing slow, shallow, uneven. She suddenly looked smaller, older, brittle, like all her self-given authority had been stripped away. I didn't think it would become this serious, she whispered finally. It's serious every time someone misuses emergency response, I said. There are protocols, procedures. You bypassed all of them because you believed your irritation counted as an emergency. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She tried again. Nothing. She looked down, eyes watering, fingers trembling, not with rage this time, but with realization, with consequences, with the weight of her own actions crashing into her all at once. After about 40 minutes of circling around excuses, half apologies, denials, and deflections, something unexpected finally happened. She stopped arguing, her shoulders slumped, her eyes lowered, her voice fell quiet. And for the first time since the day I met her, since the first notice she ever slapped on someone's door, since the first time she tried to weaponize rules she didn't understand, I watched Corinne sit completely, utterly silent. No complaints, no accusations, no threats, no self-righteous speeches about community standards, just silence. A silence that said she finally understood she wasn't the sheriff of the neighborhood, and she never had been. Corinne didn't end up arrested. But the relief she felt was superficial and temporary, because consequences have a way of following you even when the law decides leniency is sufficient. The moment she walked out of the command office, shoulders slumped and eyes avoiding mine, she carried the weight of her actions in a way that no polite HOA warning could ever replicate. I had drafted the documents, logged every infraction, and coordinated with the proper authorities to ensure accountability without turning a minor chaos into a criminal case. But that didn't mean the lessons would be easy. She received multiple forms of formal reprimand, designed to leave a permanent imprint on her record. A formal warning that explicitly stated her misuse of emergency services violated municipal codes and HOA procedures. A fine for filing a knowingly false report that was calculated not to ruin her finances, but to sting just enough that she would remember the seriousness of calling law enforcement frivolously. And a mandatory neighborhood mediation session that required her to face the neighbors she had targeted, explain herself, and listen to the impact of her actions. A process she loathed, because she preferred power and control to confrontation and accountability. In addition to these immediate consequences, restrictions were placed on her HOA authority. She could no longer initiate contact with law enforcement for what she arbitrarily decided was suspicious activity. No HOA meeting could sanction emergency responses without written approval from multiple board members, and her ability to enforce neighborhood rules was strictly limited to non-law enforcement actions, effectively neutering the self-appointed powers she had wielded for months. Walking through the neighborhood afterward, she felt eyes on her from every window, every porch, every street corner, neighbors whispering and occasionally glancing with thinly veiled amusement or cautious approval at the officers she had once tried to summon for imagined threats. Even the officers she had called, those she had summoned in panic or anger, expressed a mixture of relief and restrained humor when they learned she was finally under formal limitations. Apparently, Corinne's calls had become legendary, whispered about in roll calls and shared in break rooms as cautionary tales of a homeowner who confused personal annoyance with legitimate emergencies. They thanked me later, not because I enjoyed her humiliation, but because they recognized the effort to protect both officers' time and community safety. Karen herself tried to maintain a facade of normalcy, but it cracked at the smallest triggers. A siren in the distance, a sudden knock on the door, or a neighbor mentioning an incident she had reported. Each reminder made her flinch, each echo of her past impulsiveness a new lesson in restraint. Slowly, carefully, she began to understand that influence over a neighborhood did not grant license to misuse power, that the safety of the community could not be compromised for petty grievances, and that accountability was inevitable when authority was abused. Meanwhile, the neighborhood returned to its normal rhythm. Mail was delivered without fear of false alarms. Sprinklers ran on schedule without scrutiny from an overzealous HOA president, and officers responded to calls without diversion from unnecessary or fabricated emergencies. Karen remained part of the community, but her aura of self-proclaimed authority diminished like a shadow at noon, replaced by caution, and perhaps reluctantly, respect for the systems in place. The incident became a quiet legend among neighbors and law enforcement alike, a story told to new residents or officers in training, as an example of the consequences that follow when enthusiasm for control crosses into violation of rules and law. And although she could walk freely down the street, she now did so with careful awareness, her power reduced, her impulses tempered, her reputation indelibly marked by the day she learned that consequences, unlike fear, are permanent. The weeks following Karen's official reprimand were marked by an almost surreal calm that settled over the neighborhood like a soft, late-autumn fog, a quiet that contrasted sharply with the tension and chaos that had dominated life for months prior, as if the community itself had collectively exhaled and decided to reclaim its peace after the storm of petty accusations, fabricated emergencies, and self-important interventions had finally passed. Karen avoided eye contact for weeks, moving through her home and along the sidewalks like a shadow, careful to shrink her presence and keep her distance, aware now, perhaps more deeply than ever, of the line she had crossed and the consequences that had followed. And as the days went by, the absence of her constant interference became almost disorienting, neighbors remarking quietly to each other about the change, noticing the mailbox left untouched, the leaves in the yard left uninspected, and the driveway no longer scrutinized with obsessive suspicion, a normal rhythm returning in which children could play, cars could park, and small domestic imperfections, trash bins slightly out of place, a lawn slightly overgrown, could exist without triggering a summons of unnecessary emergency services. Gone were the incessant emails, the late-night calls, the frantic pounding on doors demanding explanations, apologies, or immediate compliance with arbitrary standards, replaced instead by the simple routines of everyday life, the kind that rarely make headlines but are quietly, profoundly restorative. And the neighbors, sensing this reprieve, began to relax, sharing friendly greetings on the street, small waves from porches, and the occasional knowing smile toward one another. A silent acknowledgement that the tension had lifted, the unwelcome drama now firmly behind them, while Karen herself, though still present in the neighborhood, had adopted a posture of caution, rarely appearing outside her home, and when she did, her eyes lowered, her expression neutral, and her voice subdued, a reflection of the lessons learned from her misjudgments and the unmistakable knowledge that her former sense of power had been permanently curtailed. Evenings became peaceful once more, with the sun setting over well-kept lawns and quiet streets, the faint hum of distant traffic, and the occasional chirping of crickets replacing the imagined sirens, false alarms, and frenzied calls that had once dominated the soundscape. And in this newly reclaimed calm, I found myself walking the streets with my wife, sharing quiet conversations, sometimes laughing softly at memories of the chaos now turned into stories, teaching the officers in training about proper procedure, and reinforcing the importance of boundaries, respect, and accountability, while the neighborhood continued its gentle rhythm, free of unnecessary interventions. One evening, As the sky bled shades of pink and orange into the horizon, Officer Davis drove by in his patrol car, slowing near our house and flashing a familiar, respectful wave, pulling the window down just enough to call out over the quiet streets, "Glad you handled that, sir. The whole precinct owes you." I waved back, a smirk tugging at the corner of my lips, and replied lightly, "Just doing my job on and off duty," knowing full well that the balance of authority, respect, and proper procedure had been restored, that the neighborhood could finally enjoy the silence that comes not from fear or indifference but from genuine peace, and that Karen, despite her earlier missteps, would carry with her the indelible reminder of what happens when personal ambition overrides communal responsibility. While my wife continued her work training officers, her presence a quiet anchor of competence and calm, ensuring that the lessons of that day would resonate far beyond the boundaries of our street, that order and safety would always take precedence over ego and overreach. And as the sun finally disappeared behind the horizon, leaving the neighborhood bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, I felt a rare satisfaction that the storm had passed, the community healed, and that in the aftermath of Karen's errors, a stronger, wiser, and more peaceful environment had emerged, one where people could finally trust the system, trust each other, and live without the constant shadow of unnecessary drama hanging over their heads. Months passed, and the neighborhood noticed a profound, almost shocking change in Karen's demeanor, a transformation so stark that longtime residents whispered about it behind their curtains and over coffee tables, remarking that the once domineering, frantic, self-important HOA president who had treated emergency services as her personal toy had become a noticeably calmer, quieter version of herself, walking slower, speaking softer, and choosing her words with a caution that was entirely foreign to the Karen they had known, as if the command office meeting and the official reprimands had somehow drained the reckless urgency from her body and replaced it with a cautious awareness of limits, accountability, and the very real consequences of misusing authority. Word quickly spread through HOA channels, community grapevines, and casual neighborly conversation that the meeting in which she had been confronted with evidence of her misdeeds, the thick stacks of documented false reports, the officer statements, and the cold, professional way the matter had been handled, had fundamentally changed her worldview, with some residents claiming they had seen her sitting alone in her car for a full hour after the meeting, tears streaming down her face as she realized, perhaps for the first time, that her ego-driven actions had created chaos and disrupted not only the lives of others, but also her own sense of self, while others recounted that she had attempted to tender her resignation from the HOA immediately afterward, only for the board to refuse her paperwork because, in their own pragmatic way, they recognized the need to retain a person to assign blame whenever another complaint arose, as if her presence, even diminished, still served a bureaucratic purpose, and despite the irony, the lesson had sunk in. Karen never, under any circumstances, called the police again, not even when truly unusual or inconvenient events occurred, like a raccoon slipping past her fence to steal her garden gloves, nor when the neighborhood dog escaped into the street, nor when a delivery truck blocked her driveway for 10 minutes, nor when a suspiciously quiet neighbor had left a window slightly open, all of which would previously have been escalated into emergency calls, complaints, or immediate accusations. Instead, she quietly observed, dealt with minor annoyances herself, and kept her interactions with officers minimal and strictly procedural, demonstrating a self-restraint that was startling considering her prior behavior. And in watching this evolution, neighbors and even the officers she had once summoned frivolously felt a mixture of relief, mild disbelief, and cautious respect, realizing that she had learned the hard way that power without responsibility leads only to embarrassment and repercussions, while humility, patience, and acknowledgement of one's limits bring lasting peace. In the months following her transformation, small signs of change became apparent everywhere. Her emails were polite and brief rather than threatening or overbearing. Her HOA meeting comments were measured and factual rather than inflated and dramatic, and her interactions with neighbors were no longer laced with implied authority, but instead carried a quiet, almost apologetic tone, as if she understood that leadership required empathy and accountability, not personal gratification. Children who had once learned to fear her presence now waved without hesitation. Neighbors could leave their trash bins out without worry, and officers no longer sighed when her name appeared on their call logs because, remarkably, it never did. The streets regained a rhythm that had been absent for months, punctuated only by ordinary natural sounds, mail arriving, sprinklers running, casual chatter, rather than the false alarms, unnecessary police responses, and imagined threats that had defined the previous chapter of the neighborhood's life. And in this restored calm, Karen herself seemed to find an odd sort of freedom, liberated from the compulsive need to control, to escalate, and to dominate. Discovering instead that her presence could exist without interfering in every minor incident, that patience and observation often produced better results than panic and escalation, and that a single, well-considered action was far more effective than a dozen impulsive, misguided interventions. The transformation was so complete that, for anyone witnessing it now, it was difficult to reconcile this composed, cautious, reflective Karen with the former version who had once called officers over a slightly crooked garden gnome. And while some residents doubted her permanence, those who interacted with her daily could attest that she had internalized the lesson fully, carrying forward an awareness of consequences that ensured the mistakes of the past would not be repeated, and the neighborhood, once held hostage by fear of petty complaints, could finally breathe, relax, and exist without the shadow of unnecessary escalation looming over their front doors, with Karen herself quietly serving as a testament to the fact that accountability, when confronted clearly and effectively, has the power to change behavior, even in the most obstinate and self-important individuals, proving to everyone that the long months of false alarms, official reprimands, mediation sessions, and personal reflection had not been wasted, that lessons were learned, boundaries respected, and that peace, hard-won, carefully maintained, and deeply appreciated, could finally prevail over chaos, fear, and overreach, leaving the neighborhood in a state of calm satisfaction, officers free to do their jobs without diversion, and Karen walking among them as a reformed figure, carrying the quiet wisdom of experience, humility, and hard-earned restraint, never again to call the police for imagined infractions, never again to escalate minor issues, and never again to forget that authority without responsibility is a dangerous illusion. In the end, the entire fiasco, which had consumed weeks of tension, diverted police resources, disrupted the calm of an entire neighborhood, and left multiple parties frustrated, started simply because Karen could not stand being wrong, because she allowed her ego, her self-importance, and her fragile perception of authority to dictate actions without regard for consequences, boundaries, or the people affected by her decisions. And as the dust settled, it became painfully clear to everyone involved that boundaries matter, not as abstract rules, but as tangible lines that protect individuals, neighborhoods, and even the officers tasked with public safety. Authority matters too, but not in the way Karen had imagined it. True authority comes with responsibility, accountability, and an understanding that power is not a tool for personal vendettas or ego satisfaction, and misusing real emergency services, even once, carries consequences that ripple outward, affecting innocent people, diverting crucial resources, and undermining the trust between the community and those sworn to protect it, which is exactly what Karen had done, repeatedly. Until the command office meeting, the formal warnings, the fines, the neighborhood mediation, and the restrictions imposed by the HOA finally forced her to confront the reality of her actions and recognize the gravity of her behavior. Meanwhile, my driveway, the literal epicenter of this saga, remained mine, untouchable, a quiet symbol of personal space, legal rights, and the absurdity of a petty feud elevated to official emergency status. and as neighbors returned to their routines, observing the calm and noticing the absence of unnecessary complaints, it became clear that officers were finally able to focus on actual emergencies rather than spending hours responding to spurious calls about garbage bins, diagonal parking, minor yard discrepancies, or imagined threats, and the neighborhood itself settled into a rhythm of ordinary life, the kind that feels invisible until it is disrupted, marked by normal human activity, peaceful coexistence, and mutual respect. And through it all, Karen herself had transformed, moving with cautious awareness, speaking softly, thinking twice before acting, and never again calling the police over trivial, personal annoyances, learning, perhaps more thoroughly than anyone could have predicted, that the world does not revolve around her sense of grievance or her self-declared authority, that rules exist for a reason, that other people's time and safety are as important as her own, and that a simple driveway, a boundary as mundane as a strip of concrete leading to a garage, could become a monumental lesson in humility, responsibility, and perspective. She had seen firsthand the cascading effects of her actions. Officers delayed in responding to real emergencies, neighbors frustrated or fearful, the HOA caught between enforcing rules and managing chaos, and herself facing formal reprimand from authorities she could neither intimidate nor influence. And all of these experiences converged into a single, undeniable truth that she could not escape, a lesson that no mediation, no apology, no board meeting could erase, a lesson imprinted in the neighborhood's collective memory and in her own behavior. So that even months later, when a minor inconvenience arose, a raccoon in the garden, a misplaced package, a slightly crooked mailbox, she paused, considered the implications, and refrained from escalating matters unnecessarily, understanding finally that thinking twice before dialing the police is not just wise but essential, especially when the person on the other end is someone capable of oversight, authority, and evaluation, someone who can see through frivolous complaints. And in recognizing this, she found herself limited not by external constraints but by the internalized lessons of consequence, restraint, and respect. And as the neighborhood thrived in restored calm, officers free from pointless diversions, neighbors free from petty interference, and personal boundaries respected, it became abundantly clear that the ultimate lesson from the driveway was not about who owned the pavement, but about the balance of power, the necessity of accountability, and the enduring truth that no one, no matter how self-important or imaginative in their authority, can override the rules, the law, or common sense without facing repercussions. And so life continued peacefully, quietly, orderly, with Karen forever changed, the driveway untouched, the officers relieved, and the community enjoying the hard-won stability that comes when lessons are learned, boundaries respected, and authority exercised with wisdom, responsibility, and restraint.